Welcome to Becoming Untriggered, a podcast brought to you by psychodynamic coaches and parents of three, Lavinia Brown and Andrew Lynn.
Together we normalise and unpack common challenges faced by couples and parents, explore how these could be symptoms of unprocessed trauma, and support you with the tried and tested tools for you to show up as the mum or dad, partner, and person you deserve to be. Welcome to Becoming Untriggered podcast. Today we're looking at violence in relationships, essentially anger and how that manifests, who is responsible for that dysfunctional manifestation of a normal emotion, how you can deal with it, and how you can help your children not carry on with the same issue that you might have within your relationship.
Yeah, so we work with a lot of couples where anger and rage and even violence is part of their relationship. It's not necessarily just always the man that is the angry or violent one. It can be the woman as well. So we see it from both sides. But also the interesting thing that we see in all of these relationships is that one person may be volatile and angry, but there's always a trauma bond. So there's always somebody that's either repressed or believes that their responsibility. So there's two sides to an angry or a violent dynamic in a relationship. We're going to discuss those a bit later. But first we're going to talk about why violence even enters the relationship, why somebody becomes violent. We're going to talk about the causes of that.
The biggest cause, which I think it's obvious to everyone, is repressed anger. Repressed anger will have to come out somehow. There's no way that it can stay in, or you'll get older and so you've got less bandwidth and less energy to hold it down. So repressed anger from childhood, let's start with that one. If you weren't allowed to be angry, either because your parents didn't approve of anger or because perhaps you had yourself an angry parent and that put you off that whole emotion because it seemed really scary and violent when it was expressed around you, you decided that that was too scary and violent to go towards. So there are lots of ways in which you might have repressed your anger, but when that is repressed, it will come out to the same degree of strength as the degree to which you've repressed it. I always think of a jack in the box. You know, the more tightly coiled that spring is in that box, the more violently it will come out. So repressed anger from childhood is a big factor in an adult being more explosive, more volatile, and unconsciously releasing what is anger, essentially that's overflowing.
Yeah. Any disproportionate response in adulthood is caused by a hijacking of yourself from repressed emotion. That might be from childhood, it might be from last week, but often it is from childhood, like you said. And it may be that you experienced lots of things in your childhood that made you angry, and that angry experience was too big for you to experience, so you had to repress it. Or it could be that you grew up in an environment where anger wasn't allowed and we're all pretending to be nice and we're all pretending that nothing bad ever happened, which was my experience actually, or similar to my experience. And therefore you label that emotion, anger, as bad or negative, and therefore you just store it away because you're not even allowed to express a certain amount of it.
Yeah.
But there's also things like carried emotions. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think the difference between the two, because they both come from childhood, are the way that they make you feel. Repressed emotion from your inner child, i.e. the emotions that you felt as a child or as a teenager or as a young adult, those are yours. They are your emotions that you felt, but they weren't able to be released at the time. There's a slightly different form of repressed emotion, which is also from childhood, but it wasn't yours. So when you're expressing the first kind, you will notice that you are acting like a child, or you are acting like a teenager, or you are acting like a young adult. It feels a little bit out of control. It feels like you're having a tantrum. So that's when it's your old, stuck emotions. Carried emotions are slightly different. So again, they're repressed from childhood, but they were never yours. As I've said many times before, children pick up on energy. They know whether you're angry or not because they can feel it, whether you show that or not, whether you decide to display that or not through your words or actions or not. That's one form of carried emotion. When you had a parent who was angry a lot of the time, but didn't allow themselves to show it. You will then take on that anger and you may express it at the time. That's often why children play up. If you're like, why are my children being so difficult right now? It's probably because you are angry, but you're not showing it. Or if they weren't allowed to show it, then they will repress it. But you're repressing someone else's anger. So the first kind can feel quite overwhelming because it's a child's raw, visceral anger. This second kind can make you feel like you're a bit crazy because it doesn't quite fit with the circumstance. It doesn't really make sense why you're reacting like that. And the other kind of repressed anger that is carried is the raw, visceral, adult anger that might have been unleashed on you. For example, maybe you were physically punished. Maybe you were spanked. Maybe you were hit. Maybe your parent was very mean with their words. So again, you might find yourself being really mean or hitting or being violent towards your children. And if it doesn't feel like you, if this is a display of emotion that you don't show in any other area of life, that means it was carried from the perpetrator of violence to you as a child.
Yeah, it can also be even witnessing violence that's not directed at you. So it can be witnessing your parents being violent towards each other, or even one of your parents being violent towards somebody else. You can take on that through carried emotions. I think that's obviously where generational trauma comes from, generational violence. Somebody hits you, you're carrying that forward, you're probably more likely to hit your children and then also express your anger onto somebody else. If you're an adult and you've got two types of anger coming up inside of you, a child's anger has got very different energy than an adult's anger, that violence, that really strong, even rage, right? You're experiencing that. That's the thing that's coming up that you're attaching to. For me, that's probably actually one of the differences between what you do with it is where the origin of it comes from. If it's your child anger, like you said, you can probably feel that. You can probably process that. If it's an adult's anger and it's mixed with you experience it as a child and how overwhelming that might have been, and how difficult to process that would have been, I think you're much more likely to attach to it and act it out.
Maybe, I don't know. In a way, I find it easier to manage, well now at least that I've done all this work, to manage my inner child's anger. There was a mixture of role modeling as well, but also feeling like I was having a tantrum. And it feels out of control, but it doesn't feel out of character. That, for me, that's the real difference. Whereas I notice when I was projecting carried anger, I've said really mean words rather than actions, really mean words to my children. And I've noticed because the vocabulary I've used is vocabulary that my mother used to use. She would call me poisonous. And here I was calling the children poisonous. And then I was like, what? That's not even my word. I don't use that. I think that's a really good clue. If it feels really out of character, it's not you. So I think that made it easier for me to manage because I was like, well, that's not mine. I'm not carrying that forwards. I could make a clear distinction between controlling something that wasn't mine was controlling what is mine. For me, is harder.
Yeah, I agree with you. But it's probably a bigger charge when it's carried because it comes from an adult. The origin is not from a child. The adult's anger that they're projecting onto a child is their repressed anger, right, of their childhood or their carried anger. So it's had 30 years, 40 years of being repressed down. And then the explosion of that anger is like an erupting volcano. So that's where it gets its power from. Whereas the child's original anger hasn't been repressed for 40 years. So it's got maybe a bit of less of an impact.
Maybe. I mean, it's complex, isn't it? But what we're trying to do here is help people notice the different kinds that they might be feeling.
For sure, yeah.
And I've got another one, which is carried again and again repressed, but it's slightly different flavors. So some family dynamics, and I think you touched on this, your family was quite like that. Anger wasn't really acceptable. It was something that was a bit distasteful. You don't show it.
I wouldn't say that, but there was a positive spin put on things. So we were like trying to make the best of things. So it's like, everything's going to be fine. Well, let's presume that everyone's doing the right thing and let's say everything's going to work out.
Yeah.
Well, it's not the reality all the time.
Yeah. So this is where a family dynamic may not fully consciously approve of displays of anger, but because they don't, and it has to come out somewhere, because just because you repress it doesn't mean you don't feel it. Just because you want to look on the bright side doesn't mean that anger doesn't exist for you. It does. So that anger is going somewhere. And this kind of carried anger is when you were the scapegoat or the pressure cooker and you were the one that would explode, probably because you were more authentic and more emotionally mature, even as a child or adolescent, than the rest of your family. But you were the one that allowed yourself to overflow with that anger, and then you were blamed for it. But the toxic bit of it is that everyone actually knew that. So even though you were being blamed for being the one that's out of control, the one that's you got anger issues, you don't have anger issues at all. You were the vehicle through which that family anger was being channeled because you couldn't hold it anymore. So it's really toxic. I've had quite a few clients like that. And then another one, feeling it perhaps on an even bigger scale, not just on your family, but on the collective. You know, there's so much to be angry about now. So many of my American clients are so angry about the current political state of affairs. And, you know, it's hard to know where to put that anger. We could say that we've also got massive collective anxiety. But in terms of anger, yeah, if you're feeling that on behalf of the world, and one of my mentors coined that as impotent rage. It's this rage that you don't necessarily know how to manage because it doesn't have a solution. You can't do anything with it. That you can also carry. So different kinds of carried emotion.
It's bloody hard not to be angry, basically, at the moment.
Yeah.
And you've got to do the work. You've got to be conscious. You've got to process it. We've talked a lot about why people are angry, the origin of it, and then essentially how that turns up in the relationship is they get triggered for many, many reasons. They're stressed, whatever it is. And then the box of anger opens, they attach to it, and then they often project that onto the other person, the kids or the partner. And that can be the man or the woman. So let's talk about the dynamic that we see quite a bit, how this gets entwined into a relationship. Because if you've got one person that attaches to anger and is maybe violent, and they're unconsciously looking for a partner, there'll be lots of people that that's not a match to. And most people that haven't got any trauma won't accept that, won't be attracted to that in a partner. They may be attracted to them at first, but then the violence will come out and then they'll see it and they'll be like, okay, no, I don't want that in my life. I'm not going to accept that. But we see people that have been in a dynamic, in a relationship for a long time, and actually they've got kids. And those people that are in long-term relationships when one of them's violent, there's two sides to that story. So I want to talk about why that happens, the trauma bond there. The person that's receiving the anger or on the receiving end of violence is often the victim of that. And that's often the position that they take. We speak to a lot of people that obviously aren't happy that their partner is violent. Maybe they're staying in the relationship because of the children, but they very much hope and expect that other person to change in order for the dynamic to change, in order for the violence to change. And what we try and do is help that person look at it from their point of view. So why are they in a relationship with somebody that's violent? Why did they stay in a relationship with somebody that's carrying that anger? And that often comes down to their trauma, their response, their trauma response. So often a lot of these people go into a flight or a freeze. Yeah. So they'll go away from the violence. They won't fight. They won't fight back. And also importantly, a lot of them believe that it's their responsibility to help this person, to solve this person's problem. And then thirdly, it comes down to self-worth. Do I deserve to be with somebody that loves me and nourishes me, or do I deserve to be with somebody that is violent towards me?
Yeah, it's also about whether they take, like you said, responsibility. Is it their fault? I mean, obviously, if they're taking the victim stance, they're saying consciously it's all your fault. But underneath that might be, well, actually, it's my fault because I deserve this because as a child, it was my fault when my parents fought. So it's a complex one to undo.
Yeah, it is.
You can't ask one person to do all the work. It's never one person's work. Obviously, violence is extreme. No one is condoning that. But where does it come from? And how are you contributing to it? This is slightly different, but I also like, how are you winding that other person up, maybe unconsciously? I think in the couples that we've worked with, it's a bit like siblings, actually. One sibling that's a bit of a bully and one sibling that isn't. It's never that straightforward. The one that is good, inverted commas, is always needling away somehow, maybe unconsciously, but they also have a part to play. I think it's quite mirrored in adults as well. The one that thinks that they're the victim, they've quietly been winding the other one up for a while. I don't think any of the clients we've worked with, and definitely me, they're not people that explode straight away on day one. That anger takes a while to build up, and that partner is definitely contributing to that build up and to the miscommunication also that leads to the explosion. Not wanting to see that person's angry, not holding space for them to release it, dismissing it, belittling what they feel angry about as something not important. All of these factors contribute, and often that person doesn't take responsibility for that, because ultimately their behavior is more, inverted commas, reasonable. So because it's reasonable and because the violence is obviously more unreasonable, they absolve themselves of all blame. But it's not just about what's reasonable and unreasonable.
We talk about people like meeting in the middle, and these types of couples, they're not balanced. You've got one person who generally moves towards the other person, who wants interaction, who wants more, who's more demanding. And then you've got another one who's armored, who will fight. So it's very difficult for this person to go towards the other person, because they feel attacked. They feel they don't want to be vulnerable to this person because they know they're going to get smashed around the head.
There's relationship trauma.
So that really impacts both people's ability to actually change that dynamic.
Yeah, it is hard to meet in the middle. And I think for the victim, inverted commas, it's often about standing up for themselves. They are not saying no. They are not putting up boundaries. And they're also not managing how they show up outside of a conflict. The conflict is a result of the dynamic in the relationship that isn't working.
I think the most important thing about acknowledging that both people have a role to play is that if you want to come out the other side of this, if you want to heal the anger and the violence in your relationship, you both have to take responsibility, because you both have to do the work. If the person that's got the anger and the violence is the only person that's going to do the work, right, then they will change. But then you've just got this other person that probably doesn't love themselves very much and will take responsibility for everything and won't meet that person in the middle. The relationship will inevitably end if the victim, the so-called victim, doesn't do any work to meet in the middle. That's actually the big challenge around this that we find, is that when there is this dynamic, it's very hard for this person to acknowledge that they have some responsibility in it.
I think it comes down to what we've said before. Trauma doesn't look a certain way. Just because behavior is unreasonable doesn't mean that person is more traumatized than the other one. If there's a dysfunction in any relationship, whether that's with your children or with your partner, both of you are responsible. Both of you have attachment trauma, because that's what attachment is, connecting in a secure, calm, connected way. Let's look at solutions. Obviously, inner child work, looking at the emotions that may have been repressed, have been repressed. Everyone's got repressed emotions from their childhood. Finding conscious ways to release that and healing the root causes of those emotions and the reasons why they were repressed in the first place. So really looking back at your childhood, and this is maybe something that listeners can do, because I get quite a lot of my clients to do this, is looking at the legacy of your father or your mother and looking at how that legacy, so let's say with the father, how that legacy of your father has affected how you see men in society, what you believe you expect from a man, what you feel you deserve from a man, how it's affected how you view your husband, your partner, and what you believe a husband stands for, what his role is, and then the role of a dad. So obviously you can do that with your mother as well. But so much is inherited unconsciously.
Yeah, and that conflict, that point of conflict, is actually where all the work is, or most of the work is, for both people. So the person that's being triggered, feeling the anger, attaching to the anger, and the person that's receiving the anger and shutting down and running away. It just in that microcosm of the relationship is where the work is. So the person being able to feel and release and manage their own anger without projecting onto somebody else. And then that other person being able to feel the fear, feel the responsibility, feel themselves shutting down and be able to hold space for themselves while they're doing that so they can release all the emotions of that. And then, like I said, parent both those parts of you. If you're the victim, you're able to stand up and say, no, I don't accept that. If that behavior doesn't change, I'm leaving. I'm creating safety for myself, for my children, all these types of things.
And I feel that bit's maybe easier. So I do think that part definitely has a big responsibility. Maybe it's because that bit's not me. I'm the more violent bit. And I think that's harder to control because it's maybe harder to give yourself permission to release it in a conscious way.
The emotion, I think it's the responsibility of the person that's being violent towards the other person to not do that. And an anger in some ways is easier to find and release because it's like, why am I angry? I'm being completely unreasonable here. So you can be aware of that. You can feel that. That's an easy one to feel, right? And you can release that if you've got the right tools. Whereas the other one's more subtle. The other one is, okay, why am I taking responsibility for this person's anger? Where's the root of that? That's much more difficult to find and release.
So it's complicated. So obviously there are lots of factors that contribute to you repressing your anger. We've touched on them. Dysregulated. How regulated are you in normal life? Whereabouts are you in your cycle? This is a massive one for women. So many women experience themselves as very different the week before they bleed and their menstrual cycle. Why is that? Because part of you needs headspace, needs quiet, needs contemplation time, needs alone time. You need to meet your needs. And if you're not doing that, this is exactly where this anger will spike. So it's really good to be aware of whereabouts you are in your menstrual cycle and use that as a tool to understand yourself better. It's not your fault. There are various factors at play, one of them being hormonal and one of them being your needs being met. So if you're a bit of a martyr mother and you never look after your needs, this is when you're going to get more angry.
Yes. Briefly at the end, we want to talk a little bit about how this is reflected down to the kids. Most of our listeners have got kids, most of our clients have got kids. So if we just rewind back to why we're angry, right? It's because we either couldn't express our own emotions or we weren't allowed to. So it's important to reflect on this and how we turn up for our kids. There's nothing wrong with anger. It is a human response. There's actually only a problem with it when it gets built up and we can't express it and it turns to rage and violence. Part of being a parent is about the ability to hold space for your child's anger.
And accept it as normal. Many of my clients are surprised when their children hit or bite or kick, whether it's towards them or towards other children, and they want to shut it down. They've heard that, gentle parenting, respectful parenting, it's all about co-regulation, which it is. But I argue that co-regulating anger is not the same as co-regulating anxiety, for example. Co-regulating anxiety, you might be with your child, you might reassure them that you're there, that it's okay, that they're safe, and that you're experiencing it together until it goes. Anger is a force. It has an energy that anxiety doesn't. And I believe that anger needs to be released. Anxiety, not so much. You can kind of managing it without releasing it. But anger, if someone told me to calm down and breathe, that would annoy me more. That would wind me up more. So I suggest to them, well, don't necessarily shut it down. Don't get your child to calm down because they're not feeling calm in that moment, right? They want to hit, they want to kick, they want to bite. So what can you do to channel that anger out in a way that is safe for them and for you in a controlled environment?
Just to recap, if there is anger and violence in your relationship, or not even in your relationship, if you are angry or violent, it's manifesting in your relationship or elsewhere, it's because you're carrying repressed anger into that experience and it's being triggered and hijacking you and taking you out of the moment. Just like with all triggers, we want to be reacting from the present and reacting proportionally to what's going on, especially in our parenting and in our relationship. So if that's you, either yourself or you're in a relationship with somebody that's like that, then the key is to explore that situation, how you're both feeling in that moment when the trigger's there and the energy is there. Learn how to release that emotion, witness that emotion, be conscious about it, let it go, and then parent those parts of you that are triggered, that didn't get what they needed in those moments of childhood. And then you can turn up as the self-loving, present partner that you want to be, and also parent that you want to be, so your children can have a healthy relationship with anger.
If what we discussed was helpful, please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. For more of the same, check out my social media, The Inner Child Healing Expert, or to work with me, go to laviniabrown.com.
You can find me on andrewlin.net or Life Coach for Dads on Instagram. We work with both individuals and couples. If there are any topics you'd like us to cover, please reach out. Thanks for listening.